I don't think this so-called peace deal, peace negotiations is going anywhere. Well, I think that he believes that they're going to win until, as long as he thinks the United States and Europe will not do what's necessary to help Ukraine. So, because the U.S. has turned its back on Ukraine, or President Trump seems waffly about does he really want to support Ukraine against Russia, and because most European countries seem to be still don't have the sense of urgency about helping Ukraine, stand fast the 5% agreement. I think Putin sees all that as weakness. And clearly, the fact that his army has suffered over 1 million casualties, that's not going to be what drives Russia out of the war. I think as long as he is able to continue exporting oil and gas to China and India, and he gets revenues for that, and until he gets real domestic pressure, which seems unlikely, I think he's content to keep doing what he's doing. That's been his narrative, which you described very well, going back to the famous speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, where he kind of, and so many Germans where I live, they always refer to that speech like, wow, we should have been listening to the warning coming from Vladimir Putin. But people like you were listening to it, fortunately. Um, I think that the idea for Russia, the strategic objective is first and foremost to make sure that Ukraine does not survive as a sovereign state, for a variety of reasons, not only because he can't bear the idea of a prosperous, liberal, free, uh, capitalistic, democratic Ukraine right on his border, where Ukrainians have a higher standard of living than do Russians. And I think there are some aspirations to regain what he sees as rightfully Moscow's, such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Georgia. But Ukraine, of course, is the big prize. Um, so what's important for me, or the implication is that the West has to realize that that's Putin's objective. And so in order to defeat him, we have to take steps that will dissuade him from thinking that Russian victory is inevitable. And I think that means that economic tools, us, not just sanctions, but using all of the frozen assets and shutting off their ability to export oil, that's going to be the key to victory and getting the Russians to the table. Even if we kill 2 million or kill or wound 2 million Russian troops, I don't think that's what will do it. When I heard President Trump yelling at President Zelensky there in the Oval Office, one of the worst days of my life watching that. And he said, "You got no cards," meaning, there's no way you can win against Russia because it's so big and it's so much better. And of course, President Trump's understanding and grasp of history is pretty mangled, and his geography is pretty weak. But also, him and other people around him don't understand why people fight. I mean, you could say that the colonials didn't have the cards when we rebelled against Great Britain. Or you could say that the Taliban did not have the cards when they defeated us in Afghanistan, or the Viet Cong didn't have any cards when they defeated us in Viet, and on and on and on and on. Why do people fight? And the Ukrainians are fighting for their survival. And he doesn't get that. And that is compounded with the fact that, because he would have never done it himself, by the way. I mean, his own personal avoidance of the draft is pretty well known. But that, combined with what you've described so well as this perception, and unfortunately, there's a lot of the so-called Russia experts in Washington, as well as here in Germany, that absolutely believe that, like, come on, there's just no way. It was revealing that the governor of the Russian Central Bank at their big economic conference several days ago, where she said that they were headed towards a recession, and her assessment of the economic situation in Russia was not nearly as optimistic as what he was saying. And, I imagine she's under enormous pressure having said all that. But what I don't know, and I would not know as an outsider without access to the highest levels of classified information, what's actually going on inside the inner circles. I mean, at some point, you would think that the oligarchs and the people that keep Putin in power would say, "Okay, this is enough. We're about to go over the cliff." Um, but of course, he's done such an effective job of scaring the hell out of everybody around him, and he's got such a powerful interior or internal security apparatus. It's unlikely that there would be a out out and out rebellion of some sort. And I don't think you would know better than me that Russians are prone to take to the streets, that sort of thing. So that's why I think it's going to have to be in the long term economic ruin that finally brings about a situation that's acceptable to Ukraine. Um, I also think, and push back on this if you want, but I'm thinking that the Ukrainians sense that, okay, they're not going to be able to count on the United States, not really, not in a meaningful way. Although nobody should predict what President Trump will do because he is flexible, let's say. Um, but also the Europeans, at least half of Europe has still not grasped this with the sense of urgency necessary to do what needs to be done to help Ukraine win. So the Ukrainians are thinking, all right, I think that they're going to adopt a strategy of denial long term, kind of like the Israeli model, and focus on uh, growing their own defense industry, continuing to grow that, modernizing their defenses with or without help from the West, um, going after Russian airfields, seaports. They've demonstrated they can touch every square kilometer of Russia now, so there is no safe place. You can't hide behind the Urals anymore. So airfields and seaports are going to be constantly attacked, not every day, not every week, but there's going to be a constant. And much like the Mossad goes after Hezbollah leadership and Iranian scientists and Hamas and other leaders, I think every senior Russian officer for the rest of their life is going to be looking over their shoulder and checking under their car for years and years and years to come, because I think this is going to be Ukraine's strategy of denial, as long as they can do that. Well, certainly the physical part of it was very important because it did, as you say, remove a big chunk of their ability to launch cruise missiles against Ukrainian cities that were delivered by bombers. And of course, these are aircraft that cannot be replaced, not anytime soon because they don't make them anymore. And I don't know the full extent of damage of the ones that were only damaged, not destroyed, but where are the repair parts coming from that would to make them whole again? So I suspect that the impact is even more significant than we might know. But that's only a part of it. The other part is now um, Russian leadership, at least, can see that every square kilometer of Russia can be touched, either by some sort of unmanned system or sabotage or special operators or the GUR. Somebody can get everywhere. And that's got to be really psychologically uh, difficult for the Russians since they have always been able to rely on the vastness of Russia as part of their overall defense. If they could just absorb invading armies until they can destroy them. So this will have to change their mindset. And then finally, I imagine that there is a lot of um, uncertainty. I mean, how could the GUR penetrate Russia so effectively? How have they been able to get through and deep into Russia and do these things? So if that creates a lot of distrust in a society, which I think already is loaded with distrust, a kind of chaos, that can only be helpful for Ukraine. I think or maybe it's judo is actually where you use
Just
your
judo,
opponent.
isn't it, with the mass? Yes.
But nonetheless, and of course, Putin is a judo guy, so it's even more delicious to see them struggling with this. Now, of course, they still have mass, and they can absorb a lot. And I think the Ukrainians know probably what their own limits are, but I think they also know that they can't stop, and that they don't need. Uh, they can do a lot with a little bit of help, particularly if it's help with long range precision strike capability, whether it's a drone that's capable of carrying a larger payload. I mean, they can already reach, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers, obviously, but if you've got one that carries a larger payload, um, I mean, that could really begin to take a toll on Russia's oil and gas infrastructure. Um, if we fail to disrupt in any significant way Russia's ability to export oil out through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, pretty soon I think we're going to see an increase in the number of Ukrainian attacks against that oil, the infrastructure where they're loading up tankers. Those things are going to start being targeted increasingly, I would imagine. I think that the price of oil um, is one of the main considerations for the Trump administration because obviously, he campaigned on lowering gas prices, he campaigned on getting interest or inflation down, and so anything that raises the prices, um, that's going to factor into what he wants to do. Um, Otherwise, I think it's such an obvious bit of leverage for the West to shut down these shadow fleet vessels that pass through the Baltic Sea, which is totally controlled by NATO countries and EU countries, and then the Black Sea, which Turkey, of course, controls the straits, and they're unlikely to do something direct against Russia. But I don't know that we've really tried to make that because the Turks don't trust that we would back them up. So it's a real vulnerability. So I can only imagine that we haven't done this is because like sometimes with sanctions, you know, you suffer also, that there would be an impact on us or on China. And so none of these things are not happening in a vacuum. Impact on China and on India is not inconsequential. And about 70% of what Russia exports goes to China and India. So I don't mean to be too simplistic or dismissive of those concerns, but this goes back to what has been our problem all along, is that we never said our strategic objective is to help Ukraine defeat Russia, get them back to the 91. So because we never clearly identified a strategic objective, we've not been very good at identifying the policies that would help us achieve that objective. When I was at the Chalk History Festival this past weekend, this was one of the things we discussed of how, when people say, oh, we can't produce enough, Russia's producing so much more that we in Europe can't do it, that's only because we haven't tried. I mean, when you add together the economies and industries, defense industries of all of the nations of the EU, plus UK, plus Norway, plus Canada, forget the US, it dwarfs Russia. So why are we having a problem? And it's because we haven't gotten into this mindset that we have to help Ukraine win. It's for our benefit here in Europe. We haven't made the necessary changes to the law in the different countries to enable faster growth. And in 1942, after the Arcadia Conference, when Churchill and Roosevelt agreed it was strategically the priority to defeat Nazi Germany first, even though it was Japan that had attacked the United States. And when at a time when no Americans wanted to get in a land war in Europe again, they still agreed Germany first. And so from the beginning of 1942 and 33, 44, in less than 3 years, we went from being the number 17 army in the world right behind Bulgaria to having 12 million women and men in uniform and tens of thousands of tanks and bombers and dozens and dozens and dozens of aircraft carriers in less than 3 or 4 years. So it really, what we lack is not industrial capacity or potential. it's the self-confidence and the determination that this is what is the priority, and civilian leaders that are willing to explain that to us why you have to do it. So, um, if we wanted to, Russia would have been knocked out of this a couple of years ago, but we haven't demonstrated the political will to do that. Well, I think, of course, he's already at war with us. We just don't think of it as being at war, but all the things that Russia does in the Baltic region, for example, the espionage, I'm sorry, the sabotage, the destruction of undersea cables and pipelines, the violations of airspace, the continued use of shadow fleet vessels, each of which is an environmental disaster waiting to happen. I was just in Salisbury and by the great cathedral there and was reminded of, they used a weapons grade chemical agent against Russian defectors. So, I mean, they're willing to do anything. And so far, we have not really figured out or shown the willingness to inflict real consequences on them. And they can see that. I was speaking to a Dutch friend for whom I have great respect. I said, why can't we, the West, and when I say we, I'm American, obviously, but living here in Germany, why can't we do things to inflict consequences, such as seizing these um, shadow fleet vessels? Guaranteed, most of them are not properly insured, or they have 100 safety violations, or, I mean, even the EU sanctions commissioner, Mr. O'Sullivan, refers to them as end of life vessels. So why don't we just seize them? And he said, well, they're in international waters and we'd be breaking the law. I mean, okay, so you do that 3 or 4 times, though, the Russians will raise hell about it, and then you begin to disrupt their ability to export oil. Same thing, what they do out in the when they go out of the Black Sea, then they transload from these terrible vessels to more secure tankers in the Aegean, and then they head off to their eventual. We've got to stop that. And I think the alliance ought to be able to do some things, or maybe it's not NATO. Maybe it's a group of nations that are that are going to suffer the consequences otherwise. So I think we could do something that would cause real problems for them. But the Russians see that so far we don't have that unifying leadership, because I think there's been too much self-doubt, too much, oh, we can't, negative. Russia's too big, and nations don't want to have to worry about facing Russia on their own. At the same time, there's a reason that London has always been referred to as the Londongrad Oblast, because there is so much incredible Russian wealth there. There's here in Germany, the Russians have so much influence financially and through business means all over Europe. In Greece, I mean, these tankers, you have Greek ship owners that are making huge amounts of money because of this export of Russian oil. So until we get serious about it, and I wish the United States was more forward leaning into this with real decisiveness, we're not. So this is where Europeans are going to have to decide, um, okay, if Ukraine capitulates or is finally exhausted or whatever, the risk for Europe only goes up. It only gets worse. And more important than 5% is put money into helping Ukraine defeat Russia. That would be the best possible investment Europe could ever make in its own security. Yeah, Russia first. I mean, that should be our strategy. If you help Russia, if you help Ukraine defeat Russia, that completes the isolation of Iran. And then China would say, well, okay, the West is serious. They have political will, they have capability. So it would also help deter China from making bad decisions. But the Chinese have got to be watching what's going on now, thinking, okay, there's not this unity of effort and political will, especially since everybody wants Chinese markets and everybody depends on China for so much. So um, I think the idea of Russia as an ally, and you put your finger on it very well. Russia did nothing to help Armenia when they were getting mauled by by the Azeris. They did nothing to save Assad except offer him an apartment in Moscow. And now they've turned out they didn't do anything to help Iran. And that's either because um, they don't have anything they could do because they're so um, stretched fighting against Ukraine. So it's not like they had something they could send to help. Or there's this sort of strange relationship they have with Israel. I think Putin the other day said that there's 2 million Russian-speaking Israelis, that Israel is almost like a oblast of, I mean, that kind of language. I mean, when you look at the people that President Trump has around him now, none of them would ever say, Mr. President, that's illegal, or we can't do that, especially, and I'm talking about the Secretary of Defense or the chiefs of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. They won't do that. And so I imagine that there is significant pressure on the people in uniform. I mean, just go back to this fiasco after the very impressive and effective raid that the strike that we launched against the nuclear program of Iran. I mean, incredible what the Air Force was able to do as part of a joint force with Navy help and all the others. It was huge. But then the president was so quick to say we obliterated it. And then his Secretary of Defense, who was only there because he's 100% loyal, said yes. And then he attacked the press for saying, well, wait a minute. But the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, of course, he said, well, BDA, battle damage assessment, takes a long time. So yes, we hit it, but so a much more professional, sober approach. I can only imagine that he would have been said, hey, you need to get with the program and understand that this is about more than just whether or not they took them out. And so, but of course, our tradition and the oath these officers took to support and defend the Constitution, they're never going, and they should not publicly push back or, Mr. President, that's illegal. They should be doing it behind doors, but publicly they should not be doing that. What I'm most disappointed in is the retired four stars that are saying nothing. Only a handful: Admiral McCraven, General McChrystal, Admiral Stavridis, General Wesley Clark, and General Barry McCaffrey. Those are the only five four stars that I have seen publicly criticize the administration for the deployment of Marines into Los Angeles, the way they're using the National Guard, all these other things that are inappropriate, if not illegal. And the other four stars, the silence is deafening. And I think this is unfortunate because they need to take the pressure off of the guys in uniform.
Absolutely. And I hope to follow up some of those themes in subsequent conversations as well this month. Ben, it's been an absolute delight speaking to you once again. And I know the audience will share that feeling as well. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for everything you do in this informational space. It is certainly appreciated by everybody in the West, and also I know Ukrainians as well, who often sort of drop your name into the conversation as one of their greatest allies. For today, though, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John.
Many of you generously contributed to buying a truck, a 4x4 vehicle, for the armed forces of Ukraine in our recent marathon fundraiser for Car for Ukraine. That vehicle was delivered thanks to your generosity and refitted in Lviv with life-saving reinforcements, the doors, windows, and the engine area. That vehicle was destroyed a few weeks after it was delivered at the front in a drone attack. All three servicemen survived with only minor scratches and concussion. Your generosity in funding the vehicle was instrumental in saving the lives of all three Ukrainian soldiers. Now we are launching our Christmas Tree Trucks 2025 campaign. The goal is to raise €11,000. So please help us buy another vehicle for one of the most effective Ukrainian brigades on the fourth Christmas of Ukraine's epic fight for survival against an imperialistic and genocidal neighbouring state. Help us celebrate the heroism of the soldiers who have held the line against all the odds, who fight for their freedom and pay a terrible price, while also, incidentally, protecting the freedoms of Europe.
Yeah, unfortunately, the answer to all that is yes. I do think that European allies and partners, including UK, are still hesitating, waiting to find out what is President Trump actually going to do. Yes, unfortunately, the answer is yes to all of that. I think countries in Europe are still waiting to see what the Trump administration really intends to do. And we've been on a bit of a roller coaster. I mean, one day the president's very angry with Vladimir Putin, says he's going to do this and that. Then there's a phone call, then he backs away. Even the two sanctions that were announced a couple of days ago with great fanfare, when you peel it all back, they actually are not that significant. So I think because of the uncertainty of what the U.S. is going to do, Europe is still hesitating, not fully prepared to commit to helping Ukraine all out to win. Well, first of all, I was pleased that authority to do certain things, such as helping with the Storm Shadow strike the other day, that authority had been delegated to the commander of U.S. European Command, who also is the Supreme Allied Commander, General Grinkovich, who goes by the call sign Grinch. That took Bridge Colby out of the loop. And Colby, Undersecretary of Policy Colby, had been anti-Europe, anti-Ukraine all along, thought everything should be focused entirely on the Pacific. So whatever the strategic thinking is, the good news is that General Grinkovich has the authority now to do certain things like this. What's difficult for me to figure out is how much of this is part of a real clever, broader strategy versus different policy decisions that may or may not be interrelated. For sure, General Grinkovich and his staff have a plan, but the administration, the Department of Defense, I think are entirely focused on the Western Hemisphere, Venezuelan drug boats, building up combat power off the coast of South America. That's where their real interest is. If it helps Ukraine that we're able to do things that are good for Ukraine, which is, by the way, good for Europe and good for America's interests, then for now, I certainly am happy with that. Well, of course, not bypassing the Pentagon. I mean, all of the military structure comes under the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense is the commander over Commander U.S. European Command, Central Command, Southern Command, and so on. It's a particular part of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, what we call Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, that has been bypassed, which is a good, healthy thing as far as Europe and Ukraine go. It would not, I mean, this is normal that there would be huge debates inside any administration. That's always been the case about where should priorities be, what should we be doing. During the Biden administration, there were huge debates inside the national security structure and the Pentagon and State Department about what should we be doing. So I would say that's healthy, that you would have people arguing over strategy and policy. I don't have as much confidence now because we don't have the traditional national security structure anymore. The director of the national security staff is also Secretary of State Rubio, both of which are incredibly challenging full-time jobs. So we just don't have our normal processes in place. I think it's very important that people should appreciate how much we value in the military our oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's the ultimate authority, is the Constitution. Now, obviously, in the chain of command, the president is commander-in-chief, and then you have the Secretary of Defense, and then you have the combatant commanders. There was a significant reduction in the number of what we call judge advocates general in all of the services, where the top judge advocate general for each service was removed. And this is important because it takes away from commanders the ability to get competent legal review of things that they're being asked to do. When I was in Iraq and Afghanistan, we consistently relied on legal review of different types of targets or types of operations because you wanted to make sure that what you were doing was in compliance with international law, as well as contributing towards the mission. Now, if you're a commander at almost any level in U.S. military and all the services, you don't have the same amount of legal review to help you think through what are the issues here. A lot of people are very concerned about the strikes on 10 boats, alleged drug boats from Venezuela and elsewhere in South America that have been destroyed, and somewhere around 40 people have been killed in these strikes. The administration has made no attempt to explain the legal justification for this. They've only asserted it and said, well, these are carrying drugs, therefore they're enemies, therefore we can kill them. That doesn't quite, that won't pass normal legal review. And I think commanders should know that while the president may have immunity, thanks to this Supreme Court decision, they are not guaranteed immunity. And so what we called in the military the Nuremberg defense, you can't say, well, I was just following orders. That doesn't work. And so I think people need to be very conscious of what they're doing now at all levels. So you are far more expert than me, Jonathan, on all things Russia, but we do know that war is a test of will. And even in Russia, at some point, families or people, and I don't know where that point is, will say no more. I mean, there's a report almost every week of Russian soldiers being executed by their chain of command or being beaten for not attacking vigorously enough or for attempted desertion. I can envision a situation where a 1917-like scenario happens. But I've been told so many times by people who really do know Russia, like, you don't appreciate their willingness and ability to endure privation. Now, it could be because they don't have it their start point is so low that it's not quite the same as if you ask Londoners or people from Washington to endure privation. It's hard to imagine that they're going to keep doing this endlessly, except to be driven into doing it. And then, of course, one of the things I worry about is if Ukraine fails, and of course that only happens if we fail, then you have tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops that are trained that will be forced into the Red Army with their equipment, those that couldn't escape or get out of there. So, they will be absorbed into Russian formations as well. That's another negative outcome of if we allow Ukraine to fail. So I think that would be true whether or not Russia had invaded Ukraine. You've got the rise of right-wing extremist organizations, exactly as you just described, in Germany, in UK, in France, and in other countries as well. And then Czech Republic just brought Babiš back in to be the prime minister. You've got Slovakia, Hungary. So there are a lot of right-wing extremist governments out there that don't care about liberal democratic values maybe the way that you and I and most of your listeners do. Russia has of course exploited that, and I do worry that if these parties come into power, particularly in the big three of Germany, UK, and France, in even one of those, that could lead to a significant reduction in the ability or the willingness of governments to support Ukraine. For example, because the right-wing governments in these countries tend to echo Russian or Kremlin talking points and sentiments, and even in some countries, the far left are at least anti-Ukraine. And so there is a lot at stake that Ukraine is carrying the load right now. And if we fail them, if we don't help them to be successful, then I think we're going to end up with a much more. You've described it exactly right. almost everything that's in there is something that has either been said or has played out in front of us during the administrations since the beginning of the year. But the shocking part is like when you see it all put together and you see that it reveals very clearly, without nuance, exactly how the administration thinks about America's place in the world, its expectations, its priorities, how it views others. And when you see it all together, um, that is like, wow. I mean, they really are serious. And then you can take the pieces and put them within a broader context. Um, it is a jolt, and people should pay attention to it. Now, of course, probably the audience that you have, Jonathan, are people that are aware of these kind of things to a large extent anyway. And most people will know that the national security strategy is not an operational order that now we move out, but it does reflect the thinking inside the administration and supporters of the administration is how they think about things. And so now, because of that, things that in the past might have seemed like, well, that's weird or, like tangential, now that's like, no, they're serious about this. And so we're going to have to focus on, when I say we, that's Americans as well as Europeans, focus on how do you protect all the things we care about, and what do you do about it going forward. And it'll be interesting to see what the Republican members in the Congress, the senators and representatives, particularly the older, long-term pro-transatlantic, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine members of the Congress, which, by the way, is the majority of them, what do they say? I mean, if they don't say anything, it will confirm what has been apparent for the past year that they are either terrified of Trump, or they are looking for some way to slow this down. I'm not hopeful, unfortunately. I have seen some senior members of the U.S. Congress who were longtime champions of this transatlantic relationship. They have disappeared, and so this is going to be an important thing to watch going forward. That's an interesting take. It definitely is not isolationist, but it does feel like it, the administration would like to turn Europe into MAGA, to the right wing, the support, open support for really right wing parties across Europe. This is exactly in line with Vice President Vance said at the Munich Security Conference back in February. The idea that the U.S. government would intervene, or what he say? It said to correct the trajectory of Europe is a bizarre way to frame what they're talking about. Now, you are correct in that uh, most of the core MAGA people would be should be appalled by this sort of uh, U.S. sticking its nose into the domestic politics of other countries. Now, especially European countries. But this also was one of the criticisms that's out there is that this document would not pass, any serious English professors, on how to properly write, and it's somewhat disjointed. It's a combination of policy and boasting by the administration and weird things put together. So you have to kind of pick through to make sure you understand what the implications are. Now, this could also, by the way, contribute to some of the friction inside MAGA. People like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, she's resigning. She's been one of the most outspoken Republican members of MAGA, and I think this could exacerbate some of those frictions, but I don't know. Former Ambassador Ivo Daalder did his analysis, and one of the things he highlighted that this document reflects a prioritization of profits over principles. The things that the United States under Republican and Democratic leadership has emphasized the democratic values that helped us build the post-World War II international rules-based order. Um, it was never perfect. There's always been friction, but nonetheless, that was always kind of the shared understanding, and in a largely bipartisan way. Now we're talking about spheres of influence, and you were the first one that jolted me by highlighting the fact that this document cedes Europe to Russia's sphere of influence. Vladimir Putin's got to be thrilled with this thing. I mean, this is a dream for him. It's always been the Kremlin's dream to have a wedge between the United States and Europe, and this is exactly the kind of thing that will do it. Not just to create problems for the alliance, but between the continents in general. And so I think the sphere of influence aspect of this, and of course the other part of this, the other side of that coin is that the Trump administration is pretty clear in there that they're going to do whatever they think they can or want to prevent other nations from doing things inside the Western Hemisphere, which of course that includes Canada, Greenland, all the way down to the tip of South America. And now, the administration's comments about Canada becoming the 51st state and Greenland being a strategic interest, all of a sudden now these things start to um, you see them in the broader context of this strategy, and it's no longer laughable or ridiculous to contemplate that. I hadn't thought about it like that until you described it, and that seems plausible, but I'm not prepared to jump on your train yet on that. Uh, First of all, the
Give it 6 months.
I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I'm just saying that would require the European Union as a body and the nations of the European Union and the UK and Norway and frankly Canada to just kind of go along with it or to be utterly defenseless. And I don't think that that's the case yet. In fact, one of the problems has been why the Trump administration has viewed Europe as inconsequential when it comes to dealing with Ukraine and most other big issues is because they have no respect for for Europe. And certainly statements coming out of the Deputy Secretary of State who just attended the NATO foreign ministerials and others, the very overt criticisms of Europe and European institutions by administration officials now shows that they have no respect. And this is in part because they see that Europe is struggling to deal with its immigration issues. They see that Europe has, until recently, failed to take all the necessary steps to defend itself as a part of the alliance. And they also see that European countries are not able to come together on things such as delivering what Ukraine needs. Um, to get the 140 billion euro out of Belgium to help Ukraine. Haven't been able to do it. And so as long as this administration sees Europe collectively um, as incapable, then they're going to be seen as inconsequential. And I think um, your point about the administration having a extractionist approach to doing things is going to prevail unless they get pushback. It is frustrating for the president. I mean, this was known back during the first administration. He never liked having to deal with NATO, the EU, or other the United Nations, because he's not able to drive a hard bargain with individual countries the way that he would certainly prefer to. And I think that the fact that the EU sort of rolled over on the tariff thing early on, you creates or adds to the image of it being relatively weak. And so I think he's going to keep pushing there. He's going to keep looking for ways to peel off countries to do what he can, or to use Hungary, for example, as um, the somehow a way to weaken the leverage that the EU would have as a whole. I think there's no doubt that the Belgians have been getting pressure from the US to not release this money for the Russian assets for Ukraine because the Trump administration wants all that money to go back to Russia, which
Mm.
in normal times would be just jaw-dropping. This is what former Estonian President Tom Ilves calls crunch time for Europe. Ukraine is giving Europe the chance to wake up from its long security holiday and to arm itself against an increasingly likely Russian war against Europe. Um, it sounds so cynical to talk about, well, Ukrainians are buying us time, but in effect, that's exactly what's happening, and it will be a real problem for Europe if European countries don't take advantage of what Ukraine has offered. Now, of course, the best way to prevent a war between Russia and the rest of Europe would be to help Ukraine defeat Russia. And the Ukrainians are not asking for British or American or Polish or German troops. What they're asking for is are the capabilities required for them to continue stopping Russian forces, to continue attacking Russia's oil and gas infrastructure, to continue to defend Ukrainian citizens and civilians from these Russian attacks. That's what they're asking for. And my goodness, if you add together the collective economies, wealth, technology, industries, militaries, populations of all the nations of the EU, plus Norway, plus UK, plus Canada, it dwarfs Russia. So it's to me, it is very difficult to understand why European countries plus Canada are not able or willing to um, see what's happening with a degree of urgency required to do what's necessary. Invest money in Ukraine's defense industry. I mean, even while at war, Ukraine is increasing its production of weapons and capabilities and ammunition. So this is the thing they can't do is reach the scale that they need. So by investing in that as well as actually providing, whether it's made in UK, made in Germany, made in France, or made in the US, providing that to Ukraine. Um, Ukraine's not perfect, but it's the newest democracy in Europe, and it is fighting. It is doing things that gives us a chance to prepare to be better able to deter Russia. You know, the Russian gray zone operations that they've been conducting now for quite some time, but have really come to the fore here over the past few months with the not only the drones shutting down European airports 2 or 3 times a week, the destruction of undersea infrastructure, the shadow fleet vessels moving through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, and disinformation, on and on and on, all the different things, our inability to do anything about it. In fact, our inability to acknowledge that Russia is at war with us. You know, I think this is where civilian leadership has got to speak to the populations as if we are adults and say, look, we don't have to get to kinetic, but what Russia is doing is going to only increase if we are not able to inflict consequences somehow, whether it's diplomatic means or financial means or other economic means to make the Kremlin feel some pain. We have to get past this anxiety about, well, we're not 100% sure it was the Russians. Of course it was the Russians, you know, but having the narrative beforehand, before we decide to do something to inflict these consequences, having the narrative already uh, ready to go, because surely the Russians will scream bloody murder if we seize one of these shadow fleet vessels, for example, or do something to preempt drones from shutting down our airports. This is going to require. This is not the Ministry of Defense. This has got to be all the government and all of society. I imagine it's the same in UK as it is in Germany, that you've got mixed jurisdiction over who's responsible for dealing with drones that are flying over Frankfurt Airport. These are the kind of things that have to be sorted out. But if you can't acknowledge that Russia is at war with us, then you're never going to have the sense of urgency required to do what needs to be done. You know, the Germans tried for a long time an approach with Russia called Wandeln durch Handeln, change through economic relationships, basically. That they were sure that they could kind of help control Russia, prevent Russia from becoming aggressive by having strong, robust economic relationships. Obviously, that meant Germany was after cheap Russian oil and gas. That didn't work out, and now I think most serious Germans realize that that was a mistake. They say so publicly. So the idea that somehow, if we just have a good fair trade relationship with Russia, they'll behave. They'll, of course, is absolutely it's not going to be. It's not going to come out that way. And there's nothing in Russia's history, which you know better than me, that indicates that they would be they would be fine with just a good, strong, healthy trade relationship. With China, interestingly, as I look at this document, the Chinese will not be as happy, President Xi will not be as happy with it as Vladimir Putin is. Um, but um, I don't get the sense from this strategy that the administration would be willing to go to war over Taiwan. That as long as the Chinese takeover of Taiwan does not stop the flow of chips to America, it's like bad luck for Taiwan. And the same would be true probably in many other parts of the Indo-Pacific region. So it is this profits over principles, I think, is really going to play out in the Indo-Pacific region as well. And while the Chinese might not be as happy about it as the Russians, um, I think that they will exploit this kind of opening. It's hard for me to imagine that this actually leads to a just, sustainable, negotiated outcome. Um, the Kremlin has certainly indicated that they're not interested in anything that doesn't give them total recognized sovereignty over those parts of Ukraine that it's already taken, plus others that it wants. They're not going to allow any peacekeeping sort of force to come in. They want amnesty, or they don't want accountability for any of the many war crimes that Russians have committed. So these are all things that, and also, of course, they're dictating what side of his military that Ukraine can have. Who benefits from that? The Russians. So I think all of these are unacceptable from the Ukrainian side. So it's hard to imagine how you get from that to something where Ukrainians would say, okay, we can live with this, unless Europe steps in to fill the gap that is being left by the United States. And um, Europe is absolutely capable of doing this. I mean, my God, after 11 and a half years, without the United States or Europe actually committing to helping Ukraine win, Russia still has only managed to take 20% of Ukraine. And I don't see that changing dramatically over the coming months. In fact, Ukraine is starting to significantly damage Russia's oil and gas infrastructure to the point that if this continues, then probably sometime by next year, they're going to be in real trouble in terms of being able to finance the war. We've already seen one of the Russian oblasts has reported that they can no longer pay the bonuses for Russian soldiers from Russians who are signing up to join the military.
This is in
So
Yakutia, I think, wasn't it?
that's it.
Yes, they're
Thank you.
bankrupt
I,
essentially.
I didn't trust my pronunciation, but that's it. So I think that Russians are actually on the clock a little bit as well, and Ukrainians can see this better than anybody. So I don't think this so-called peace deal, peace negotiations is going anywhere. Well, the administration has been claiming that whatever the president orders is uh, by definition lawful. And they have taken this grant of immunity from the Supreme Court and extrapolated into whatever he says is okay, and therefore to question that something that comes from the White House might be unlawful, or by extension from the Pentagon might be unlawful, is that's how they're defending it. Now, when I thought about this, I thought, well, if that's true, then why do they care? Why are they so worried that people like Senator Kelly or Congressman Crow and Senator Slotkin from Michigan, was a career intelligence official, why would they care? Why would they be alarmed? If everything that this, and obviously because they know that these are illegal and they don't want to be questioned or be have to deal with that, have to defend it. They have not done the things that you would expect in terms of complying with the law, the War Powers Act. But because the Republican-led Congress has failed to make them come testify and explain and do that, then this kind of continues along. I can remember as a cadet, and I am so much older than you and most of your audience, Jonathan. I started
Not
West
not
Point.
so much, alas.
I started West Point in the summer of 1976 after I finished high school. So 76, we're to
I
my
was
right.
four, so
Okay.
I'd put that in there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Um, but that was right after the conclusion of the war in Vietnam. And America we were dealing with that. The military was dealing with that. And all of my instructors at West Point were Vietnam veterans. Um, the so this was fresh in everybody's mind, and of course the My Lai massacre was also fresh in everybody's mind, and it was pounded in our heads as cadets that our oath was to the Constitution, and that you had the responsibility to accomplish your mission, but you also had the responsibility to say, "Sir, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. That's an unlawful order." So, I mean, uh, at the tender age of, I think I was 18, 19, then I was already hearing this. And My Lai was always held up as, why you can't do that. And that, I was only following orders was not a justifiable defense against doing something and it was routinely referred to as the Nuremberg defense, that the Nazis on trial at Nuremberg said that they were just following orders from the Fuhrer. And so anybody that is confused about that has not been paying attention. It's always been that way. Now, it's easier said than done. If it's something like shoot those civilians over there or execute those prisoners, that's an obvious black and white. No, I'm not going to do that. But the system, and I think this is probably true in most militaries, but I can't speak for the British Army, for example, but the system is based on the premise that orders are lawful and you have to make the judgment if that's not lawful from wherever the order originated. And of course, you better be right if you're pushing back on it. And this is why trust is such an important part of all of this. Having legal advisors, not like your lawyer going through a divorce case, but having legal professionals that are officers that are part of targeting cells, that are part of planning cells, that are part of all that we do, who are looking for compliance with whatever the rules of engagement. This so trust is part of this. Um, but I thought it was so important for Senator Kelly and the other five members of Congress to do that, to remind people, you took an oath to the Constitution, support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Um, and you do have the responsibility to refuse an unlawful order. Well, and I would say it's also very unlikely that the Secretary of Defense, who fancies himself as a Secretary of War, but that's not a legal designation. That the Congress would have to change the law through the annual National Defense Authorization Act to call it the War Department. They're not going to do that because this is ridiculous. But anyway, the chance that Secretary of Defense is going to do something to try and get Senator Kelly back on active duty and then court-martial him is zero. Number one, because of this separation of powers, you can't, one branch of the government can't go after another branch of the government. And I think even the most diehard MAGA senators would not be willing to tolerate that. And secondly, I don't think Secretary Hegseth wants a big court-martial proceeding where all the information that's about what they're doing comes out. And so I think he prefers to the administration wants to try and draw attention to what they call seditious behavior by these members of Congress, but nothing's going to come out of it, just more division. General Petraeus was my commander twice in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And so you're talking about men of honor and also strategic thinkers. We don't want to see the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs or the chief of staff of the Army or the chief of naval operations and others, uniformed leaders, standing in front of the press saying, yeah, what the secretary is doing is awful. That's not healthy because the principle of civilian control of the military also is a longstanding part of this. And so the expectation is that, number one, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, for example, or the commander of U.S. Southern Command or U.S. European Command, in the processes behind closed doors, conveys to the secretary or the army chief or whoever that what you're talking about is illegal. We can't do this, or there's going to be enormous risk, or our allies are not going to be willing to do this, or we're going to lose intelligence sharing access. These are the debates that typically happen in a healthy environment inside a normal sort of Pentagon. And I would imagine that that is, in fact, happening. I've heard from others better informed than me that part of the reason the national security strategy just now came out is because of some serious debates and arguments between uniforms and the suits about, Europe, reducing our emphasis on Europe, for example. So that is going on to an extent. What I'm disappointed in is very, very few of the retired four stars, generals and admirals, have come out and said anything. They should be doing this, number one, because they have serious heft, but also to protect the ones in uniform. Get the former chairman, former army chiefs. But these guys, men and women, who have been deployed years and years and years in combat, so this is not about, courage. They see what happened to Mark Milley. And so each of these officers, retired officers, has to make their own decision about how do they protect what they literally protected for 35 to 40 years of their professional life. How do they continue to do that long term? And there will be an end of this, whether it's in 3 years or in 7, 8 years, there will be an end at some point. Um, how do you help us get through that without the damage being so great and irreversible? So I have heard some people say that almost wistfully that we'll get back to good old. And I don't think these are exclusive of each other. I cannot imagine going back to a scenario where you don't rely on those kinds of technologies. And as we learn more and more about how to use artificial intelligence to control swarms of drones, to go up against enemy swarms of drones as well as multiple targets, um, who's going to want to walk away from that? Now, clearly, there are people with business interests that want to see continuation of, super expensive tanks and aircraft and so on. I think we're going to keep moving forward towards the blend where you get the right capabilities based on the missions and on the theater. Um, Russia's war against Ukraine is unique in some ways, but not in all ways. You still have to have quality women and men out there, whether they're controlling drones or they're controlling rocket launchers. Um, for sure, the U.S. Air Force has been working, and I think other air forces as well, probably the Royal Air Force, on programs where you had, we call it the Loyal Wingman program, where you've got an unmanned aircraft that is tethered to a manned aircraft. And and the Navy will be doing the same kinds of things. And you'll see tanks that have tethered robotics that extend the capabilities, the effects of these platforms will reduce the risk. So, I mean, I cannot think of a single environment where we could end up fighting where I would not want to have the capabilities that we're seeing on display in Ukraine, whether it's in the Pacific where you've got different distances, but nonetheless, where the fighting is going to happen. I tell you what, I can imagine that the U.S. Navy and the Australian Navy and the Royal Navy will be looking to use unmanned systems the way the Ukrainians have against Chinese facilities or vessels. So, no, I think we're going to see continued emphasis on harnessing the potential from these capabilities that we're seeing now. Well, General Shinseki was a very, very good, wise chief of staff of the U.S. Army back about 20 years ago. Vietnam veteran, had been wounded, one of the most thoughtful people I've ever seen at the senior level. And he says, if you don't like change, you're really not going to like irrelevance. And that's, you have to embrace, that doesn't mean you have to like it or enjoy it, but you have to embrace that changing technologies have changed the character, not the nature, but the character of war.
I'm proud to say that this series of Ukrainian Advent interviews is supported by The Steel Porcupine, a unique and powerful film about a country that refuses to lie down, a people who turn themselves into a fortress of needles when Russian tanks rolled in. The Steel Porcupine is an unforgettable cinematic experience that exposes Russia's campaign of extermination in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people's spirit to resist and prevail. It follows soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary people who decided that survival meant resistance, not submission. Introduced by Nate Vance, a former US Marine who fought for 3 years in Ukraine's defense, this documentary moves from the Butcher massacre to genocide endorsing Russian state propaganda media. The Steel Porcupine is a love letter to Ukraine and a battle cry. It is free to watch and has already had a great impact on policymakers as well as activists. There is, of course, a link in the description of this video and in the comments as well. You can get to the website where you can see both the trailer and the film for free. Created by the makers of the acclaimed To the Zero Line, this is another film about humanity that clearly states there is no such thing as neutrality when war crimes are being committed systematically by Russia and on a scale in Europe only comparable to World War II. Set to a haunting soundtrack featuring music by Philip Glass and blending rare archival footage with original material. It is an impactful work of art and storytelling as well as being informative. I strongly recommend you watch it, but even the trailer itself is compelling.
I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country, and I feel a personal stake because I got them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons, and none of them believe that Russia would have pulled this stunt if Ukraine still had their weapons. And I believe Europe and the United States should continue to support Ukraine. There may come a time when the Ukrainian government believes that they can think of a peace agreement they could live with, but I don't think the rest of us should cut and run on them.
Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military have been underestimated for a period of several years now. And ultimately, I'm convinced from my reflections in observing from an intelligence standpoint that they will fight with their bare hands if they have to, if they don't have terms that are acceptable to an enduring peace.
So this is a design for a 3D printed drone frame. The engines are mounted here. The drone motors are mounted here and here and here. What I can do is export these shapes into the slicer.
This film has absolute moral clarity. It does not both sides the war. It does not use neutral language. This is a film that says clearly who invaded whom, who is killing whom, and who is standing on their own land, fighting back, showing why Ukrainians will bleed for every meter. This film is not meant to comfort you. It's meant to arm you with clarity, with solidarity, and with the stubborn, spiky hope that democracies can still fight back and win.
Children are not stupid. They're just small, right? They're just small versions of us. They know exactly who the threat is. There's almost no families within Ukraine who have not lost a family member or have had a family member maimed by Putin and his army.
The Ukrainian people are very resourceful and they're very determined, and they've got a very good reason to be determined. You know, Russia wants to exterminate the Ukrainian nation and just enslave it and absorb it. So they've got every reason to do everything necessary to win this war.
Putin was super clear when he started this war that the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign and free country was an unacceptable affront to Russian security. He will not stop until Ukraine isn't a country anymore.
We have to put Ukraine in a position of strength, that it has the means to fortify and protect itself from the economic survival to the military resilience. It's basically turning Ukraine into a steel porcupine that is indigestible for potential invaders.
Poets have spent their entire lives trying to explain the horrors of war. I am no poet. Anyone who has seen what I have seen would probably think differently about the situation in Ukraine and what the Russians are doing.